The silence of an empty Walmart parking lot tells a story no politician dares to admit. For decades, these megastores were the heartbeat of American consumer life, bright lights, endless aisles, and the promise that America was untouchable. But today, those lights are flickering. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported just 22,000 new jobs in August, a fraction of what was expected. Worse revisions revealed that the economy actually lost jobs in June instead of gaining them. Families already drowning in $1.1 trillion of credit card debt now wake up to see milk at $7 a gallon, grocery bills doubling, and homes losing value overnight. The dream once promised feels more like quicksand. And then comes the unthinkable. The crown jewel of American retail, Walmart, the very symbol of U.S. economic dominance, now faces exodus. Its shelves are stocked, but the customers are gone. Where did they go? Not to Amazon, not to Target, but shockingly to Africa. Yes, Africa. The same continent Washington long dismissed as poor and unstable is now pulling millions of consumers not just from within its borders, but from across the globe. This is not a story of shopping habits. It's a story of a world economic order being rewritten. When Ghanaian chocolate replaces Hershey's in European stores, when Nigerian textiles grace Dubai's runways, when Kenyan avocados sell directly to Shanghai without passing through U.S. middlemen, the meaning is clear. The balance of power is shifting. So I ask you, are we witnessing the beginning of America's decline and Africa's long-awaited rise, or can Washington somehow claw back its influence before the tides turn completely? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to see and support Africa's new marketplace. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. The story begins not in Africa, but in the heart of the United States, where the numbers reveal a crisis that no political spin can disguise. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the U.S. economy added just 22,000 jobs in August, less than a third of what economists predicted. Then came the real blow. Earlier reports claiming that 14,000 jobs had been created in June were quietly revised. The truth: the U.S. actually lost 13,000 jobs. What should have been a sign of recovery turned into a stark confirmation that America's economic engine is sputtering. Behind these figures lies a daily struggle for millions of families. The essentials of life, milk, bread, medicine, have become luxuries. A gallon of milk costs $7. Grocery bills balloon overnight. Hospitals demand $10,000 deposits before patients are treated. Credit card debt has soared past $1.1 trillion, trapping families in a cycle of borrowing just to survive. Even the housing market, once the cornerstone of American stability, is trembling. Homes that once symbolized security are now losing $100,000 in value almost overnight. The American dream is not merely delayed. For many, it feels broken. And while families wrestle with these costs, the icon that once stood as the heart of U.S. consumer culture is collapsing: Walmart. With over 11,000 stores worldwide and hundreds of billions in annual sales, Walmart was not just a store, it was a symbol of America's global economic dominance. Its promise was simple: cheap goods, endless variety, and unbeatable scale. Yet today, its parking lots are empty, its shelves untouched. What once represented abundance now feels like abandonment. This collapse is not driven by a boycott, a pandemic, or even a supply chain failure. It is driven by something much bigger: a global migration of consumers toward new markets. And at the center of this seismic shift stands Africa. For decades, Africa was positioned as the world's supplier of cheap raw materials: cocoa, cotton, coffee, gold, shipped to Europe or the U.S., processed abroad, and resold at huge markups. But that model is dying. In its place, African nations are building their own factories, their own distribution systems, their own digital marketplaces. Instead of exporting raw cocoa, Ghana now processes chocolate in Accra and Kumasi. Instead of selling cheap cotton, Nigeria transforms it into fashion brands, commanding global respect. Kenya's avocados and Tanzania's cashews are sold directly into Asian and Middle Eastern markets. South African wines bypass Western intermediaries and move straight to consumers worldwide. The result is staggering. In just the past 3 years, African exports of value-added goods have skyrocketed by more than 60%. Foreign investment in African manufacturing hubs is breaking records. And with the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, now uniting 1. 4 billion people under the largest single trade bloc in the world. Africa is no longer waiting for permission to join the global economy. It is rewriting the rules of that economy. This is the context that explains why Walmart is losing ground. Consumers across Europe, Asia, and even America are discovering that African markets offer something different: fair prices, cultural authenticity, innovation, and quality. The old system of inflated prices and middlemen is collapsing under its own weight. Instead, buyers are sourcing directly from African producers, bypassing U.S. corporations altogether. For Washington, this is more than an economic inconvenience. It is an existential threat. For decades, U.S. corporations like Walmart dictated global supply chains, squeezing suppliers and controlling markets. That power gave America not just wealth, but influence, soft power that extended from Wall Street to Capitol Hill. Now, with every Ghanaian chocolate bar sold in Dubai, every Nigerian fashion line displayed in Paris, and every Kenyan avocado delivered directly to Shanghai, that influence slips further away. This is the central event of our time, not just the decline of Walmart, but the decline of an entire system that kept America on top for generations. And in its place, a new system is emerging, one where Africa is not a passive supplier, but an active competitor, one where profits are not drained from the continent, but reinvested into its future. What began as empty aisles in Walmart stores is now a symbol of a much deeper shift. The exodus from U.S. retail giants is not about shopping preferences. It is about a historic realignment of global economic power. And in this new landscape, Africa is not the background. Africa is stepping into the spotlight. If the collapse of Walmart's once bustling aisles was the warning, then what came next was the earthquake. The world began to witness something that was once unthinkable: millions of consumers walking away from America's most powerful retail giant and turning instead to Africa. The symbolism was breathtaking. Walmart, with its reputation for cheap prices and global reach, had long stood as the economic arm of U.S. dominance. Yet suddenly, its very model squeeze suppliers flood, the market dictate prices was being rejected. The climax of this story unfolded when consumers worldwide realized they had a choice, and they chose differently. In Paris, shelves once dominated by Hershey's began filling with premium chocolate produced in Ghana. In Dubai, Nigerian fashion designers showcased their work in high-end malls once reserved for European brands. In Shanghai, Kenyan avocados and Ethiopian coffee arrived fresher, cheaper, and more traceable than anything routed through American middlemen. The world was voting with its wallets, and the verdict was clear: Africa represented the future. At the center of this storm was the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. With 1.4 billion people and the ability to move goods across borders more freely than ever before, African nations had stitched together the largest single market on Earth by population. No longer fragmented, no longer dependent on U.S. imports, Africa was presenting itself as a united powerhouse. And unlike the old order where Africa supplied raw materials and others reaped the profits, this new Africa processed, branded, and sold directly. The reaction in Washington was immediate and filled with panic. Congress called emergency hearings. Senators grilled Walmart executives about why they had failed to adapt. Think tanks issued urgent reports with titles like "The Retail Collapse" and "America's Vanishing Soft Power." Corporate lobbyists flooded the White House pleading for trade negotiations to reopen access to African markets. Behind closed doors, officials whispered the unspeakable: if the U.S. lost control of retail flows, it wasn't just losing sales, it was losing its grip on global influence. The fear spread beyond government. On Wall Street, hedge funds that once bet confidently on Walmart's endless growth began bleeding billions. Pension funds tied to retail giants saw portfolios shrinking. Private equity firms pivoted overnight, racing to invest in African startups, hoping not to miss the wave. It was in every sense a financial panic disguised as a consumer choice. Meanwhile, in Africa, the atmosphere was electrifying. Factories in Accra ran at full capacity, producing chocolate bars branded "Made in Ghana." Cooperatives in Nigeria pooled resources to launch fashion lines that stormed international runways. Kenyan horticultural companies adopted blockchain technology to prove freshness and traceability, instantly winning the trust of European and Asian buyers. In Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's tech startups expanded platforms that allowed direct-to-consumer retail, cutting Walmart and other American giants out of the chain entirely. And perhaps most striking of all, ordinary Africans, farmers, artisans, small business owners, were beginning to see the fruits of their labor remain in their own communities. Instead of exporting raw cocoa for pennies, they were selling finished chocolate for dollars. Instead of shipping coffee beans cheaply, they were exporting branded African coffee for premium prices. For the first time, the profits stayed in Africa, building schools, roads, and hospitals. The emotional contrast between continents could not have been sharper. In rural America, farmers stared at silos filled with unsold soybeans, prices collapsing as export markets dried up. Small-town economies, once sustained by Walmart's purchasing power, fell into decline. The same Walmart that once destroyed local shops was now powerless to save the communities it had consumed. Meanwhile, across African cities from Lagos to Nairobi, the streets buzzed with optimism. Billboards advertised African brands with pride. Young entrepreneurs spoke confidently about competing on equal footing with Western corporations. It was not just commerce, it was a revolution in dignity. For the U.S., this moment felt like losing a war without a single bullet fired. Policymakers warned that if the U.S. dollar lost its role as the global standard, it would be the equivalent of losing World War III. And yet, in boardrooms from Beijing to Brasilia, deals were being signed in local currencies, bypassing the dollar altogether. Africa, once dismissed as dependent, was leveraging new partnerships with China, India, Russia, and Brazil to negotiate from a position of strength. The high point of this global drama is not just Walmart's decline. It is the realization that Africa's rise is no longer theoretical. It is here now, unfolding before our eyes. Every empty Walmart aisle, every revised U.S. job report, every struggling American farmer stands as evidence that the old order is collapsing. And every new African brand, every successful factory, every thriving digital marketplace signals that a new order is being born. This is the climax of the story, America's fear colliding with Africa's triumph. A once unshakable empire of retail cracking, while a long-ignored continent takes its first steps as a true economic power. The tremors are not confined to shopping malls, they are shaking the very foundations of global power. The collapse of Walmart's dominance was not confined to corporate boardrooms or international trade halls. It spilled into the daily lives of millions, reshaping communities, families, and even political agendas on both sides of the Atlantic. What started as empty aisles in America's largest retailer quickly became a mirror reflecting the shifting fortunes of nations. In the United States, the social consequences were immediate and painful. Rural America, long tied to Walmart's massive purchasing contracts, felt the first blow. Farmers who had supplied corn, soybeans, and wheat suddenly found themselves with overflowing silos and no buyers. Prices crashed. Families who had worked the same land for generations began filing for bankruptcy at alarming rates. The irony was bitter. Walmart had once destroyed small local stores by undercutting them with its buying power, and now its decline was leaving entire communities stranded with nothing to fall back on. For working families, the story was equally grim. As Walmart's sales plummeted, jobs vanished. Tens of thousands of employees already struggling with low wages and limited benefits faced layoffs. In towns where Walmart was the single largest employer, this meant economic devastation. Grocery bills climbed, medical costs soared, and with wages stagnant, people were forced deeper into debt. Civil society began to fracture under the strain. Churches and community centers reported record requests for food aid and housing assistance. Politically, the Walmart collapse became a lightning rod. Congressional hearings turned into televised battles where senators grilled executives and accused the administration of ignoring early warning signs. Some politicians blamed African trade policies, others pointed to Walmart's failure to adapt to digital retail. But the public saw through it. Ordinary Americans felt betrayed by corporations that had promised security, and betrayed by leaders who failed to protect them from economic collapse. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Africa was experiencing the opposite trajectory. The civil impact was transformative. In Accra, Kumasi, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa, new factories meant new jobs. Young men and women once forced to migrate abroad in search of work now found employment at home. Wages, while still modest, were enough to feed families and send children to school. Communities that had endured decades of underdevelopment were suddenly alive with possibility. Roads were being paved, markets modernized, and new businesses launched with local capital. The political ripple effects were just as dramatic. African leaders long dismissed in Washington and Brussels as dependent now spoke with renewed confidence. They stood before their parliaments and declared proudly that Africa was no longer a supplier of cheap raw materials, but a producer of wealth. Campaign slogans shifted from aid and dependency to dignity and sovereignty. Even opposition parties who once accused governments of failing their people found themselves forced to acknowledge the economic turnaround. Perhaps most importantly, ordinary Africans began to feel a sense of ownership over their future. When a Ghanaian chocolate bar landed on supermarket shelves in Paris, or when Nigerian fashion lit up runways in Dubai, it was not just a business success. It was a moment of cultural pride, proof that Africa's story was no longer written elsewhere. Across cities and villages, people spoke of a new Africa rising not through the charity of others, but through the labor of its own hands. Back in the U.S., the contrast fueled anger and fear. Wall Street investors warned of systemic shocks as capital flowed out of America into African startups. Economists described a silent decoupling where global markets no longer revolved around the U.S. The political class scrambled proposing trade deals and subsidies, but their efforts seemed too little too late. A creeping sense of insecurity spread among the public. If America could lose Walmart, what else could it lose? The dollar. Its role as global leader. The civil and political consequences were undeniable. In America, despair deepened and divisions widened. In Africa, unity strengthened and hope flourished. What one side experienced as collapse, the other experienced as rebirth. And in that contrast lay the clearest proof yet. The old world order had cracked open and a new one was emerging. From Washington to Brussels, from Beijing to Brasilia, the collapse of Walmart and the rise of Africa's new retail order has triggered a profound reckoning. For the United States, this shift is not simply an economic challenge, it is a crisis of identity. For the rest of the world, it is an opportunity to reposition themselves in a system no longer guaranteed to revolve around American power. In Washington, the alarm bells have been relentless. Think tanks publish daily reports warning that America's global leverage is unraveling. Senators openly admit that if the U.S. dollar were to lose its role as the dominant currency, it would be the equivalent of losing a world war. The once unthinkable has entered the mainstream conversation. America might become a second-tier power. To prevent this, the government has scrambled to negotiate new trade deals, offering incentives to African nations to keep U.S. corporations in their markets. But these offers fall flat because Africa now has options. Across the globe, the reactions are starkly different. China, having invested heavily in African infrastructure, railways, ports, digital networks, is positioned as the biggest beneficiary. Beijing sees Africa's rise not as a threat, but as a validation of its own long-term strategy. By financing industrial parks and logistics hubs, China has tied its future to Africa's success. In turn, African nations increasingly look to Beijing for partnership, not Washington. India, too, has accelerated its outreach, using its cultural ties and growing tech industry to carve out a place in Africa's new economy. Brazil and Russia, eager to counterbalance U.S. influence, have stepped in with investments and political backing. The result is that Africa now sits at the center of a web of partnerships, no longer beholden to a single global power. Europe finds itself in a paradox. On the one hand, European consumers are enthusiastic participants in this new marketplace. Premium African goods, chocolates, wines, textiles are appearing on shelves in Paris, Berlin, and Rome. On the other hand, European policymakers worry that their historic dominance over African trade has been permanently broken. France, in particular, faces an existential crisis. Its old colonies, once tethered through economic dependence, are now trading on equal footing and often bypassing Paris altogether. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the Gulf states see opportunity. Dubai has become a key distribution hub for African goods, and Saudi investors are pouring billions into African manufacturing. What once seemed peripheral African consumer markets now looks like the future of global growth. For ordinary Americans, this global realignment feels distant, yet personal. They may not follow debates about the African Continental Free Trade Area or Chinese Belt and Road financing, but they feel the consequences when their grocery bills climb and their job prospects shrink. They notice when once familiar brands lose relevance to competitors from Africa. Slowly, a sense of unease spreads. If the world is buying from Africa instead of America, then perhaps America is no longer the center of the world. Globally, analysts are calling this the Great Retail Migration. But more than commerce, it represents a transfer of influence. Every Ghanaian chocolate bar sold in London, every Nigerian dress on Dubai runways, every Kenyan avocado in Shanghai represents not just profit, but prestige. And prestige is power. Africa, long written out of the story of globalization, is now rewriting the story itself. For the U.S., the perspective is sobering. No amount of tariffs, sanctions, or speeches can reverse the fact that the global marketplace has found new leadership. And for the world, the message is unmistakable. Africa is no longer waiting at the margins. It is stepping onto the stage as a central actor in the drama of the 21st century. The fall of Walmart is more than the story of a retailer in decline. It is the warning sign of a world being rewritten. For decades, America's global dominance rested not only on military strength or the dollar, but on the invisible web of supply chains and consumer culture it controlled. Walmart was the symbol of that dominance. Its collapse is the symbol of its unraveling. And yet what looks like a crisis for the United States is being celebrated elsewhere. In Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa, the mood is one of pride and momentum. Africa, once dismissed as dependent and weak, is now building its own factories, launching its own brands, and exporting with confidence. What Washington sees as a nightmare, Africa sees as a dream finally coming true. But make no mistake, this shift is not without risk. If the U.S. cannot adapt, if it clings to old systems of dominance, it will grow increasingly isolated. And if Africa cannot manage its rise with fairness and stability, the promise of this moment could fracture under pressure. We are standing at a crossroads where the choices of both continents will shape the global order for decades. So, the question is clear. Do you believe Africa's rise signals the beginning of a fairer world, or will America fight back to defend the old order at any cost? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to see and support this historic transformation, and subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines.